today, we welcome Ben Uzel, and he will be talking about Old Man River, the Appomattox River, how this 19th century commercial highway served as a link in the Underground Railroad. And I have Ben's bio. It's very impressive. He was born at Petersburg General Hospital. He was a graduate of Gibbons High School in 1975, that's in Petersburg. 1980 graduate from Virginia Commonwealth University with a BS in Business Administration and a minor in Economics, and he was only 5 classes shy of having a double major in history. In December of 2022, he retired from the Virginia Department of Taxation after 35 years of service, where he worked as a field auditor, mostly with retail sales and consumer use tax audits. Has a long interest in local history. He's the current president of the Colonial Heights Historical Society. He serves on the Revolutionary War 250th Anniversary Committees for both Colonial Heights and Chesterfield. He was appointed by Colonial Heights City Council to serve on the Colonial Heights Historical Commission as an advisory committee to the City Council. He was appointed to serve on the Colonial Heights Appomattox River Trail System, a steering committee for the trail along the Appomattox River in Colonial Heights, and he has done extensive research on the history of the lower Appomattox River and its connection with the development of the city of Petersburg. So let's give Ben Uzel a nice welcome.
Pollen outside. Yeah, that's kind of funny about the Petersburg General Hospital. They messed up my birth certificate and they put the wrong lady on there. And I did not know that until 1981. I was getting ready to go to Latin America and I needed a passport, and I went up there to get my birth certificate. And when I'm walking out, I said, oh, that's why Mama always likes my brother better. I mean, it was a kind of one of those moments. And we found out what had happened was the nurse was filling out the birth certificates, and early in the morning, and she dropped the line in the book. And so there was, my mother's name was shown on there as Laura Pettyford, and or Pettyjohn or something. And the only family I know around here with that name is a black family. So, but anyway, I'm going to start with a line that's in a history book. A novel that was written by Leslie Hartley in 1953. Some of you may have heard of the book, The Go-Between. And the first line of that book says, history is a foreign country. They do things different there. And I think I've heard other historians use that as a starting line. And I think it's, it kind of hits the nail on the head, because you really can't judge history sometimes by today's standards, because the standards then were different. And if you look at society back then, it was different. It was structured different, and there was slavery here in this part of the country back then. So, that's history's history. But if you look at the lower Appomattox River, today we see it as a sort of a lazy tidal stream. You might see a few fishing boats, maybe a kayak out there once in a while, and once in a blue moon, a tugboat with a barge of sand or gravel. But 175 years ago, that was a busy commercial highway. And it, you had ships coming and going, little flatboats coming and going between Norfolk and City Point and such, going to Petersburg. Petersburg was a very important port city at the time. And as such, when you look at slavery, the Underground Railroad, the places that were most active in Virginia were the big port cities: Norfolk, Portsmouth, Richmond, and Petersburg. Not so much City Point, because City Point was much smaller, and you probably had a population here, 400 to 500 before the Civil War. Where Petersburg in 1850 had a population of 14,000. 1860 was 18,000 and some. And so if you think about that, someone that's up to trying to get out of there, first you've got ships that are leaving, going directly to places like Philadelphia, New York. And so it's much easier to get on a ship, and if you can hide away, and if you could get out in the ocean on the ship, you know, you're probably going to be free when you get to those other places. So, and as I was doing research over the years on the river, every now and then I'd come across some story about someone who tried to escape and such as that. So the main point of my program today is really to talk some of the stories of some of the people who escaped. But you really can't talk about that in a vacuum without looking at, why is, how slavery developed in Virginia and how Petersburg developed, because both of those things play into this. This talk isn't meant to be, one of those that sort of try to rub everybody that's white, rub their nose in slavery or something like that. It's definitely not a CRT thing. In my book, CRT, I remember when that was a computer remote terminal. And I used to have one at work, it hooked on a mainframe. And so, today it means something different. But anyway, slavery is not new to the world. And, some people would have you believe that slavery started about 1619 in the United States here in Virginia, and it really didn't. I mean, slavery goes back 5,000, 7,000 years ago. And there's mentions of it in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Rome, even in the 1400s in Europe, when the Turks were invading Europe. And a lot of people don't really realize this, but in the 1400s, the Turks got up to the gates of Vienna. And as they went across the Balkan area in Central Europe, they were, if they didn't kill you, if you were young enough, you became a concubine slave or you became a slave soldier. And, that's just the way it was then. And understanding the Ottoman Empire, up until the early part of the 20th century, there was still slavery. And even today, there's, some estimates are that between 46 and 50 million people in the world today are enslaved. Now, some of that is chattel slavery, some of it's forced labor, some of it's sexual exploitation, forced marriages, or even convict labor. And all you have to do is go on the State Department's website and look up Sudan, and you'll find information on there about, how the Muslim tribes are capturing the Christians and making them slaves and such as that. And that's just been in the last few years. You have the Uyghur population in China that are, forced labor in some of the factories. And, so it's not something that's unique just to the United States. But, by the late 1700s, early 1800s, the United States had evolved into a nation where part of the country had abolished slavery, or at least almost completely abolished it, but not completely. And then the other part of the country was much dependent on slavery, the southern states. And, and some people will have you believe that, June the 19th, 1865 is when slavery ended in the United States, and it's really not. There were several states, including a couple of northern states, Delaware, New Jersey, for example, where slavery existed until December of 1865. And, I think New Jersey had a gradual emancipation, and there were a couple of slaves that were still slaves, at the end of the Civil War. In Oklahoma, the Choctaw and the Chickasaw tribes, they had black slaves until 1866. So, it's if you look at on a local level, slavery in this part of the state right here would have ended when the federal troops occupied the area. So during the siege of Petersburg, when City Point and all was, the big federal supply center, slavery would have been, the slaves here would have been freed. But if you went just a few miles down the road to Petersburg or the bulk of Chesterfield or Richmond, those people were slaves until April the 3rd, 1865, when the Union armies occupied those areas. So just a few thoughts on that. Where's that clicker? This is a map here just showing the Appomattox River between Petersburg and City Point. And back years ago, the river was really the main highway between those two places before the railroad was built in the 1830s. And even as late as the early 1920s, it was difficult at times to drive from Petersburg to City Point. And my grandmother used to tell me that, there were some areas there where the road, it was just a dirt road, before the 1920 when they started building the state highway system. And that, people were stuck all the time when it was wet weather. So just keep that in mind, the importance of the river as a commercial avenue moving things. So if you had something large to move, you wouldn't be moving it by a truck or something back in the late 1800s. You'd be moving it by the river. Let me talk a minute here about, this is a photo that was taken probably about 1900 of the harbor in Petersburg. This just gives you an idea, there were still ships there at that time. I want to talk just a second about the Underground Railroad, some of the terms that are used. The Underground Railroad, it gets its name from a newspaper article in 1839 that was in the Washington newspaper, where one of the reporters had interviewed a young slave girl, and she made the comment that she hoped to, quote, escape on an underground railroad that ran underground all the way to Boston. And somehow it got printed that way, got picked up, and the next thing you know, that name, that term, came to mean this organizations that were helping slaves escape. And they had certain terms that sort of were railroad terms. The passengers, for example, were the escaping slaves, sometimes also referred to as refugees or the kidnapped. The ticket agents, they coordinated the safe trips, and sometimes these folks were in cities like Philadelphia or Wilmington or New York. And they had correspondence with station masters, as they called them. Station masters would be the people that hid the slaves either in their homes or in a barn or a church or something like that. And then you had the stockholders and the conductors. The conductors were the ones who actually did the guiding, maybe from one safe place to another. And when you're talking about someone escaping by sea, a lot of times it was the mate on the ship, or one of the stewards on the ship who helped hide somebody on the ship. Or sometimes it was the captain themselves. But a lot of times the captains didn't even know there was an escaping slave stowing away on the ship. The stockholders would be the ones, mostly northern abolitionists, that provided funding to these organizations so that they could keep operating. And there was one gentleman, and this gentleman right here, he helped a lot keeping a record of the Underground Railroad. His name was William Still, and he was born in New Jersey, and he moved to Philadelphia in 1847, and he got a job with the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery, and he worked there as a clerk. And he interviewed most of the slaves that came through. In fact, he assisted 647 slaves in getting their freedom. And in doing so, he would interview them, get them to tell them, well, what were the circumstances? Who owned you? What did you do? What was your occupation? Different things like that. And using all that information that he had saved, in 1872, he wrote a book about the Underground Railroad. And his notes in his book were very helpful in, reuniting a lot of the families that had been broken up by slavery after the Civil War. And I said I was going to mention a little bit about slavery, and I don't have all the time to do all of this, but let's mention this right here. Slavery in Virginia really just didn't start as chattel slavery. It started as indentured servants. And this was the case, this actually started in 1609 in the Virginia colony. And it was the Virginia Company, which was the one running the colony at the time as a commercial venture. They would pay for the passage of people from England to come over to Virginia. And then once they were here, these people were somewhat in a quasi-military situation where they were actually working for the company. And they were living under harsh conditions and scant food and such as that. And there was a problem with a lot of these indentured servants escaping into the woods and trying to live with the Indians and such. when in 1619, the Virginia Company changed that so that they were still paying for the purchase, but then they were renting the person then to a planter in Virginia, one of the farmers. And the theory there was, well, the indentured servant would pick up a trade, and then, after their indenture was over, which was usually 7 years, then they would be able to support themselves. However, and that's the same year that the first Africans came to Virginia colony. And history's always told us when I was a kid that it was a Dutch ship that brought them. And I think historians believe now that that was actually a British pirate ship that was, commissioned by the crown to, cause havoc for the Spanish. And they were operating under a Dutch flag just to kind of cover themselves. But the first indentured servants, they seem to have a difference in the law between those that were Christians and those that were non-Christians. And that seemed to be a differentiation for a while until the law was changed later, so that anybody that was a slave, you weren't going to get your freedom if you became a Christian. But and then after 1620, the Virginia Company changed that so that anybody who was an indentured servant, they would be purchased by the planter, for their rights of labor for the indenture period. And then that planter, if they wanted, could sell them to another planter. But by 1650, this is an interesting little fact, there were 300 Africans in Virginia, but there were 4,000 white indentured servants working in Virginia at that time. So, by 1661, the Virginia passed legislation noting a difference between indentured servants and servants for life. And as you go through time, things slowly changed, and the case for the Africans who were servants became worse and worse. In 1680, the House of Burgesses passed an act for preventing Negro insurrections. In 1705, October 1705, the legislature passed the slave code that declared all slaves to be real estate. And from that point on, things didn't get any better. And by 1760, the last Africans were being imported into Virginia from Africa. And the place where that was occurring was right across the river here at Bermuda 100. There's a Reverend Herbert Towns, lives in Chesterfield, but he's has a church in Amelia. He's done some research on the early slave ships in Virginia, and it appears that the last ones came about the late 1750s, maybe about 1860. And they only went up as far as Bermuda 100. A couple of the ships went up to Osborne's, which is up near Dutch Gap. But other than that, there weren't any slave ships going to Petersburg or to Richmond. It seems like that was the place at Bermuda 100, and then if anybody was interested in slaves, they came and bought them from there. But next thing you know, you've got 1776, the American Revolution, and then 1781, and then in 1784 is sort of the big year for Petersburg. In that year, I guess you could say the stars of Providence aligned for Petersburg. And one of those stars was the Peace of Paris of 1783, which was the peace treaty between Britain and the United States to end the Revolutionary War. And that really did not take effect until the early months of 1784 because Congress had to approve it, such as that. Another thing was the General Assembly combined the towns of Petersburg, Blandford, and Pocahontas. And that made for a more efficient port system. Another thing that happened was Robert Bowling, the gentleman who owned the area called Bolingbrook, and would include basically the property between Blandford and Petersburg at the time. He started beginning to develop the Bolingbrook area. And that's Bolingbrook Street, Bank Street, such as that in Old Town Petersburg today. And that ended up becoming one of the big business and residential centers for the city as it was growing. And the other thing that was important was the trade resumed with Britain because of the peace treaty. And Petersburg had something that Europe wanted, tobacco. And at that point, Petersburg ended up being, for several years, the largest exporting port of tobacco in the United States. And you wouldn't think that today if you go to Petersburg and you see the river all silted in places and stuff. But back then, it was a deeper channel, and ships were leaving, going to Scotland, going to London, going to Bristol, going to Amsterdam, places like that, loaded with tobacco. The town sort of took on a gold rush town type of thing, and people that were coming here noted that everybody's drinking, and there's a lot of gambling and horse racing, and doesn't seem to be much interest in education or religion. And there was a big, I guess you could say, a big religious void after the American Revolution, because most folks didn't really care to belong to the Church of England. We've already split the Anglican Church, and so there was a bit of a religious vacuum. But within a decade or so, that changed, and in the late 1700s, early 1800s, it was a big religious revival. And two of the main groups in this area of the country were the Methodists and the Baptists. And both of those, basically, two of the big pillars of those were temperance. They were both against drinking, and also abolition. However, in the South, a lot of people didn't want to give up their slaves because that was the source of their wealth. So you had the Southern Methodists who basically agreed with everything the Northern ones did except abolition. And you'll find that with a lot of religions. Some didn't break as a separate religion. Some, if you're in New York, you've got one view. If you're in Richmond or Petersburg, you've got another view. And a lot of it had to do with, your income and where it was coming from. This is the town seal of Petersburg right after it was combined, and it shows a ship at dock, and at the bottom there's a large barrel and some small barrels. The large barrel would be for a hogshead of tobacco, and the small ones would be barrels of flour, because there was a lot of flour exported from Petersburg. This is a advertisement in one of the newspapers in 1802 in Petersburg, showing the arrival of a ship and the departure of a ship, and these you found in the newspapers back then, telling you this ship's coming in and it's going to have all the new fashions and everything, so people would know to go down and try to buy the new goods. At this time, there were probably four major things about slavery, I guess I could mention. Most people think of slavery as, you've got the guy in the house and you've got the field hand. And it was really a little more complicated than that. The owners of slaves had really several options of what to do. They could free their slaves, but after a certain year in Virginia, if you were freed, you had to leave the state, which meant you'd be away from your family and your friends, and you'd be in a strange country. If the other thing was, they could sell the slave. Well, if they sold the slave, there was a situation at this time. There was no longer importation of slaves after 1808. And so if you're in the deep south, which is expanding with plantations for cotton and such, and they need the labor, they can't get slaves from Africa anymore. This part of the country, Virginia, northeastern North Carolina, Maryland, there's an excess of slaves. So you can see the natural market. Slave leaving here, they get sold. Well, the highest bidder is probably going to be the slave trader who's going to take them down to New Orleans or Mobile and get a higher price down there. And there were people that did that, and I'll mention that in a minute. The other thing, and of course, if a slave got sent to the deep south, it was harsher conditions. They're away from their family. The climate is a little harder down there, and their life expectancy would not be as long. Another thing that an owner could do if they had slaves was just to hold on to the slaves. And some of the larger slave owners did that. And I believe that Richard Epps here, with the exception of when a slave became troublesome, he kept all his slaves. He wasn't looking to sell them. Same thing with Robert Buckner Bowling in Petersburg, the guy that lived in Center Hill. He had like almost 500 slaves, and claimed that he never sold a single one. And some people say, well, that sounds harsh. But not really, because A, it's an extra overhead on your finances, and B, but you're keeping the families together, and you're not sending people away, you're not treating them as a commodity. And then you had the last thing that they could do, and that people really don't think about, you could hire out your slave. Rent your slave to a factory, or rent it to another farmer, such as that. The advantage of that for the slave in some cases was that the slave would still be near his family. And the slave would, in some cases, were actually treated pretty good. And if they worked in a factory or something, and the master only required a certain amount of money, for the rental, the slave got to keep the rest of the money, and sometimes could acquire some wealth. And some of the slaves that did that actually purchased their own freedom later. But in other cases, that wasn't the case. And sometimes they might be under, harsh conditions where they're working and not have much money. Most of the money goes to the owner. And I was going to talk about this guy right here, but I don't think I have the time. Y'all know who Joseph Jenkins Roberts is? He was his mother was a slave in Norfolk. He got freed. His father would have been the master. His last name was Jenkins. And after his mother got her freedom, she married this guy named James Roberts, who was he ran a flatboat business between Norfolk and Petersburg. And so they ended up moving to Petersburg. This guy, Joseph Jenkins, his name Roberts is then added on because of his stepdad, helped to raise him. And they became a very wealthy family in Petersburg. Well, Joseph Jenkins Roberts got involved in the American Colonization Society. And this was a group where they were trying to send the free blacks back to Africa. And it was probably a bit of white supremacism behind that idea. But, some folks felt back then that, blacks were inferior, but they're people and they should have their own country in Africa. So there was this colony started by the American Colonization Society, and today it's the country of Liberia on the west coast of Africa. And this guy right here, he would have been working at one point on the Appomattox River on flatboats. Eventually he's going to, in 1829, he leaves here at City Point on a ship called Harriet, and he goes to Liberia, and he ends up being the first president of the Republic of Liberia. So, we were taught in school, that Virginia's the mother of presidents, and we were given a list of 8 presidents. There were actually 10 national presidents born in Virginia, and this gentleman here was one of them. And so I guess you could say he was the first American African president, instead of African American. But you all know who the other national president was born in Virginia? Sam Houston, president of the Republic of Texas. Well, anyway, let's see. Here. I was mentioning earlier, this gentleman right here, y'all should know who this guy is. He used to live right at the house right down here between Hopewell and Jordan Point. Edmund Ruffin. He was an agriculturalist back before the Civil War. He experimented with fertilizers and crop rotation and things like that. He had some journals about agriculture and stuff that he published. He also had a house on High Street in Petersburg that he lived in at one point. And I found out later that my great aunt used to live in the same house later in the 1960s. But he had some very harsh views on free blacks. He did not like free blacks, and he thought that they were, I can't find my notes on, here it is. He was very pro-slavery, and he felt that free blacks were a nuisance, and their existence, was just a deterrence to the institution of slavery. And his proposal was that all free blacks should be banished from Virginia, and any that did not leave should be enslaved. And this guy is probably most noted. He is the person that fired the first shot at Fort Sumter. And one of his grandsons is named Edmund Sumter Ruffin. He's buried in Blanford. Anyway, that was on April the 12th, 1861 in Charleston. And this right here is a receipt from the late 1700s for the rental of slaves. There was been a little formal process. Here's one that's a printed one that's from the Library of Virginia. And this was about 1860, so this was right before the opening of the Civil War. And usually in these, I've seen some for some of the railroads. Some of the old railroad grades around here, like the old Norfolk and Western going down to Suffolk, or some of the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad grades and such, were built by rented slaves. And it was usually a contract in there that the slave had to, they had to give certain clothing and shelter and such to the slaves. And a lot of times they stipulated shoes in those contracts too. And the good thing about that was, for the slave in a sense, was they're being treated a little better, and they're not being shipped to the deep south. But they're still subjugated to labor that they're not getting any money for in some cases. This is a notice of auction in one of the Petersburg papers right before the Civil War, and they're selling an estate, and any slaves involved were treated as chattel, just like if you had a horse or a piece of equipment. Do y'all recognize this corner right here? That building you see there on the corner is Long Streets. That's the intersection of Sycamore and Bank Street. That is known as Quailing's Corner, and it's where every beginning of every year, folks would meet there, and this is where some of the auctions were held in that intersection, and it's also where a lot of the slaves were hired out. This right here, you probably recognize this building on Bolingbroke Street in Petersburg. It's right across from the farmer's market. This is the old Henry Davis slave jail. Henry Davis was a noted slave trader in Petersburg, and he operated out of this building. And it had a different facade on the front back then. My understanding is that after the Civil War, somewhere in the 1880s, 1890s, it was remodeled on the front and became a German beer house. So my great-grandfather probably visited there somewhere along the way. But today I think it's apartments and some type of hair salon or something on the bottom floor. But you got a piece of history there right in front of you, and a lot of people don't know what it is. And this lot shows up on the Beers map in 1877 as H. Davis Estate. And if there's any doubt, this is from the 1850 census, and you see Henry Davis shows his age is 42, and you can clearly see his occupation, in trader. I'll let you figure out what that is. And this is you would see these advertisements in the paper all the time when a slave would run away. And usually you see the slave running like he's got a stick in his hand, or sometimes you'll see a woman like she's got a stick on her back with her clothes and such in a little sack over her back. This one right here, William Pennell, he had an auction. He was an auctioneer in Petersburg and auctioned off all kinds of things. And he participated in some of the slave auctions. And his name is going to come up again in a minute. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the slaves actually that escaped. I was going to mention some of the other laws. There was I probably need to mention this one. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law was drafted. And this was drafted by Senator James Mason, who was a senator from Northern Virginia. And Congress passed this largely with the support of the slave states. And basically what that law was, that if any escaped slave was in the North, that the government officials up there had to participate in capturing that slave if they were asked to, or they would be fined $1,000. And back then, $1,000 is probably about $37,000 in today's money. And because of that, that sort of forced a lot of the northern localities and states to, participate in the enforcement of slavery. And this led to, it fueled the abolition movement up north. It also led to Harriet Stowe's writing the book in 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And because of this also, escaping slaves were now not only trying to get north, they were trying to get to Canada. Because if they're in Pennsylvania or New York, they could be captured and sent back. But if they get into Canada, they're in a different country, different sets of laws, and they're safer. But also due to this law, a lot of the businessmen in New York City were in favor of it because they had strong economic ties with a lot of the ports in the South. This ship right here is the Yorktown. The Yorktown is a sister ship to the Jamestown. I know that the Jamestown visited Petersburg and it visited City Point, and it was a kind of a sidewinder steamer. And there were several ships, the Pennsylvania, the city of Richmond, a number of ships that served the ports between Philadelphia and Wilmington, Delaware, New York City, and Baltimore. And they were coming through here all the time. And some of the porters on the ships were actually hiding slaves in hiding places on the ships. And the captains of the ships were totally unaware of it. Well, in one case here, in October the 28th, 1854, there was a short article in the mayor's court section of the Southside Democrat, which was a Petersburg newspaper at the time. And it was about a gentleman, black guy by the name of Peter. He was a tall African, and he was brought before the mayor's court accused by Mr. Welsh of having assaulted him. And Mr. Welsh said that he had been walking out the Sunday morning and he was near Peter's house, and he saw, quote, a Negro whom he realized was a runaway, and he was concealed in some bushes. So he went home to get his stick and was keeping the guy in sight the whole time. And when he came back, the guy ran away. So he went to the spot where the guy had been concealed, and he looked around and he couldn't find him. So supposing that he had gone into Peter's house, who was a free black guy, he went there, and he was refused admittance by the wife of the house, because Peter wasn't there at the time. But after threatening her with a warrant, he was admitted, he looked around, and he couldn't find the guy. Well, the next day, he happens to run into Peter, and Peter, he claims, abused him terribly, and was yelling at him, and told him he, quote, would harbor as many Negroes as he damn well pleased. And that he had nothing, that Mr. Welsh had nothing to do with it because he was not an officer. Well, this went to court before the mayor's court, and the court ordered that he get 20 lashes. So things were a little different back then. In January of 1855, David Edwards was a slave owned by John Slater, and David was hired out to work for a coachmaker, helping to make coaches. He escaped to Philadelphia and then on to Canada, and he told the committee in Philadelphia that his owner, Mr. Slater, was a very hard man, and he took every dollar of his earnings and then would dole out only $1 a week for him to live on for food and board. Now, a lot of these slaves that were hired out, they weren't given quarters by their master to live in. They were expected to find their own place to live, and they had to pay their own bills for food and such as that. And, $1 a week, that's not very much money. And, back then they were probably making less than 50 cents a day, because 50 cents a day was the going rate at the tobacco factories. And so if you were working 50 cents a day, you add that up for a year, it's not very much money. And if someone's taking most of your money and you're only getting $1 a week, it's like $52 a year to live on, not very much. And the dollar went farther back then, But anyway, this guy, he was 30 years old and weighed 145 pounds, and It was said that he was worth $1,000, and he left his wife behind, who was a free black here in Petersburg, in order to get away. Another case was Beverly Good, and Beverly was a man, not a woman. Beverly Good and George Walker, and Walker was also known as Austin Valentine, and they escaped from Petersburg on the steamship Pennsylvania, which would have looked a lot like this ship. Beverly was a young man of 24 years old and had quick intellect, and he was forced to cramp into a hiding place on the steamship. George, who was 43 years old, 6 foot tall, was owned by Eliza Jones, and he was hired out as a foreman at a tobacco factory. He was forced to pay her $110 a year and was able to keep the rest. He escaped on to Canada. In March of 1855, Mary, age 45, a dark complexion, they said she was very intelligent and was with a round build. And she was the mother of 15 children. 4 were sold away from Petersburg, 1 was still in Petersburg, and 10 had died. She was owned by Littleton Reeves of Petersburg. And when I checked the city directories and such, Littleton Reeves was a merchant in Petersburg. Mary says that told the committee in Philadelphia that Mr. Reeves was very kind to her. But on the other hand, Mrs. Reeves, quote, had a jealous disposition. And she caused Mary to be hired out where Mary was beaten and abused. On the occasion of the sale of one of Mary's children, Mary became so grief-stricken that she had violent convulsions and she was unable to speak for a month. She said that Mrs. Reeves showed no sympathy and acted as if they were just selling a cow. Mary escaped from Petersburg with the help of a Captain B. That's all that was shown in the record, but we're pretty certain it was Captain Bayless. He was one of the conductors on the Underground Railroad. And it was not William Bayless, I think it was his brother. And here's why I'm putting these pieces together. Well, in 1856, the law in Virginia was changed because of all these escaping slaves. And any vessel that was leaving Virginia waters, that was heading through the Virginia Capes for northern ports, were subject to search. And generally this would happen in the Hampton Roads area, before they went through the Capes. If any slave or person of service was found on board, the vessel would be attached and all persons aboard arrested. This amends an 1817 law where, that forbid anybody to assist a slave escaping. It was increased to the point that it said that the person would have a $500 fine and they could be confined in the state penitentiary for 5 to 10 years for each offense. So the state was very serious about this. Well, this is a story about a slave called Charles. In June of 1856, he was a slave in Bacon Quarter Branch, which was a little bit north of Richmond. And I'm trying to figure out where that's at. And I think it was somewhere in that little low area that's near the Diamond, where the bullet, right before you get to the Diamond on the boulevard, the tracks run over there. I think it was in that area right there. And his owner was a tavern keeper, and he claims that he had a very hard life and had longed to be free. And he had tried to escape once before in Richmond, but was caught. Well, this time he walked to Petersburg. And at the wharfs at Petersburg, there were some ships there, and the sailors on one of the ships told him that if he helped them load the ship, they would hide him on the boat. And they were heading to New York City. And the name of the ship was the Messenger. So he helped them, and they hid him on board. The captain was totally unaware of what was happening. He was hidden in the bow of the ship behind some cargo near a barrel of water, and he was given several biscuits. Now, it was estimated that the trip was going to take about 10 or 11 days to get to New York. If you're on these little boats, you think about going up the Appomattox and the James, you're tacking a lot depending on how the wind's blowing. And I don't know if any of you have done any sailing, but sometimes getting from point A to point B is not direct. You've got to wiggle, particularly if you're going against the wind. And anyway, 8 days into the trip, the captain starts to hear some strange noises, and he checks below deck, and he finds Charles seasick. Well, if you're going to hide on a boat in the rough ocean, the last place you want to be is on the bow, where it's the worst. So anyway, he takes him up on the deck of the boat, and he whips him to compel him to tell him who had concealed him on the boat. And Charles says that no one knew he was there, and he'd done it himself. In other words, he didn't squeal on the mates on the boat. Well, they were only about 2 days from New York City, so the captain said he was going to keep him on board, and what he was going to do is when he returned to Virginia, he was going to take him back and bring him back to Virginia where he'd be arrested. So the poor guy thought, well, it didn't work. Well, when they land in New York, that would have been on July the 9th, 1856, the captain gives him a basket and tells him to go to market and pick up a few things. So he's got this basket and he goes to the market, and he's approached by another black gentleman who tells him, he says, let's go back to the ship and get your clothes. So apparently the captain knew a few things, even though he pretended he didn't. They get back to the ship, the captain's not there. But one of the mates is there, and the mate claims he doesn't know who Charles is, even though he helped hide him earlier. And he says, but, and Charles says he wants his clothes. And he says, well, they're not your clothes. They belong to some guy that used to work on the ship, but you can have them. And they threw them on the dock. So the other black man gathered up the clothes, and they disappeared into New York City. Charles was then sent to Albany, New York, and then from there on to Canada. And then there's another situation of a ship, and this one actually happened in the Elizabeth River. It was a ship called the Gazia. And the Gazia, on July the 4th, 1856, 9 slaves waded out into the shallow portion of the Elizabeth River. And they were waiting to be picked up by another boat to take them to the Gazia, which was out in Hampton Roads. Well, they waited, and an hour and a half later, a little oyster boat comes by, and they're taken to the Gazia. Immediately, they're all placed in the hold under the ship. It was a hiding place, and it was a little hole to get into the hiding place. And 8 of them could get in. The 9th one couldn't. Mrs. Walker, she weighed about 260 pounds, and she couldn't fit through the hole. Well, then the people were kept under the in the hiding place for about 15 hours, despite the heat and everything. And then finally they were back on deck to get air. And then they all had to hide again because here came the inspection boat. And so Mrs. Walker couldn't fit through the hole. So she had to take off most of her clothes to get into the hiding place. And when the inspectors boarded the ship, they found out that the ship was going to Philadelphia and such. They also found out that the ship had just come from Norfolk, and there had been a yellow fever epidemic there. So they kind of did a cursory review and got off the ship quick, and it went on its way. So the slaves were lucky. They ended up in Philadelphia. And when they got to Philadelphia, one by one, each person was pulled from the little hole from the hiding place until they got to Mrs. Walker. And they couldn't get her out. And Captain Bayless, he was, sitting there laughing at the failed efforts. And finally, they implored him to help. So he starts to help them. And they were able to get her out of the hiding place. And they all were loaded on carriages and then taken to the underground station, so to speak, the safe house. And in late 1857, early 1858, the Gazia this time visits Petersburg. And there were 2 slaves there, Isaac and Edmondson. They were brothers. They were owned by a lady named Anne Cooley. She was a widow in Petersburg. And these 2 slaves basically were her pension, her retirement pension. Cooley had hired out these slaves and required them to hand over $10 a month, despite any doctor bills or room and board or anything else they had. And they described her, quote, as, this is the way it was written in the journal, quote, very quarrelsome, although she was a member of the Methodist Church. So apparently, you know, Methodist had a reputation then for being very Christian-like, but this lady apparently missed that part. When the brothers heard that she was planning to sell them on January the 1st, 1858, and there was always a big auction on New Year's Day in Richmond, they figured that they better get out of there, and with the help of Captain Bayless, that's what the committee records say, a Captain B, they were able to escape to Philadelphia and then to Canada. This is a advertisement right here that was in the Daily Express in one of the Petersburg papers. And it was placed on Monday, May the 31st, 1858. The Kazia is back in Petersburg. And on that day, this advertisement, it was placed by Thomas Epps. And he was sometimes referred to as Colonel Epps. And he was the owner of Powell's Hotel, which was on Sycamore Street in Petersburg. And he was offering a reward of $100 in return for two slaves, Gilbert and Sarah. And they had run away on Saturday, May the 29th. Gilbert was described as dark in color, about 45 years of age, rather above medium size, and had a suit of brown clothes, a frock coat, and a black hat. He wears his whiskers under his chin, and they're slightly tinged with gray. He is quite intelligent and one of the best cooks in the state. Well, the Powell's Hotel at the time was one of that and the Bolingbroke and the Jarrett Hotel were three of the best hotels in Virginia at the time. And if you got one of the best cooks at one of the best hotels, that's going to hurt business if he disappears. Sarah is described as light gingerbread color, well-formed, and will weigh about 130 pounds. Her height is about 5'4". Her eyes are very predominant, and they protrude slightly, and her teeth are decayed. She is about 24 years of age, quite intelligent, and has generally served as a chambermaid at Powell's Hotel. She is a servant in good address, very pleasant manners, and has a well-stocked wardrobe and a fine display of jewelry. And this is something that some of the slaves, if they required money, a lot of times some of them would save the money, some of them would throw the money away, some would invest in clothes and jewelry and things like that. And that appears to be her situation. Well, their disappearance had been noticed on Sunday morning when they weren't there. Well, at the same time, it was also found that a slave named John Bull, he was a slave of Andrew Keevan, he was also found to be missing. And Andrew Keevan was, I think he had some interest in the mills in Petersburg, and I think he may have been one of the companies he was with was one of the predecessor companies of what's now Virginia Power. And he had served as mayor of Petersburg at one time. Well, a short time later, another slave was also found missing, Joseph Mayo. And Joseph Mayo belonged to a gentleman named O.P. Hare. And the O stands for Otway. And Otway Hare was the owner of the Newmarket Racetrack, which was a very popular racetrack in Virginia at the time. And it's right off of where East Washington Street is, in that part of Petersburg near the Battlefield Park. And the other slave that was found missing at the same time was a slave named William, and he belonged to Oliver Hamilton. And he was found to be away from his duties. All of these missing slaves were reported to the police, and the police began to investigate the matter to find out what was going on. They found out very quickly that John Bull had been sighted loitering around the city wharf on Saturday evening about 8 p.m. A short time later, the Kazia weighed anchor and departed the wharf. And the harbor master thought that was rather strange because the wind was coming from the east, which would have made it extra hard getting out. And usually you waited for the wind to come from the west or the south, and you waited for high tide so you wouldn't get caught in any of the shoals. This guy was apparently not doing that. The destination of the Kazia was Newport, Delaware, and it was loaded with 1,200 bushels of wheat. And this was being shipped by the merchants Thomas Branch and Sons. The Kazia had a bad reputation. The former captain, who was the brother of the present captain, he was suspected of tampering with slaves 2 years earlier in Petersburg, and he was forbidden to ever show his face in Petersburg again. Furthermore, the Kazia, which was a low, it probably looks something like this ship right here. This is a photograph of the Spirit of Baltimore, but it's a schooner that would have been similar in design to the Kazia. It had a bad reputation. The Kazia was owned by William Dannenberg, who was a merchant in Norfolk, and he had just been driven out of Norfolk the week before, on Friday before, suspected of slave stealing. And that was a term often used with someone that was involved in the Underground Railroad. There was a lot of suspicion about the ship because of that. On Sunday, the operations of the Kazia were watched, and I guess that's as they went by City Point and headed downriver. And if you're sailing against the wind, you're going to do a lot of tacking in the river, so it's going to take you a while to get to Hampton Roads. I got to hurry up here. On Monday morning, Andrew Keevan, who was the owner of John Bull, he made an affidavit to the mayor, who was W.W. Towns at the time, that he believed that his slave had been carried off by the Kazia. He succeeded in getting a search warrant and the services of Captain Butts of the Petersburg Police Department. So Mr. Keevan, along with Henry Tennille and Thomas Epps, accompanied Officer Butts. And at 12 noon, they caught the train from Petersburg to City Point, which meant they would come right down the tracks right out here. And the W.W. Towns, which was a steam tugboat, was waiting at the docks. They boarded it and they proceeded downriver. They also sent a dispatch to the agents in Norfolk to keep an eye on Hampton Roads and the Kazia if it came by to stop it. But it only took them about a little over an hour to catch up with the Kazia. And they caught up with it at a section of the river called Minge's Reach, which is that little stretch of river between Windmill Point and Fort Powhatan. And when they caught up with it, and of course the captain of the ship says, there's nobody here but me and the mate. Well, they board the ship and they start looking. And after considerable effort, they find Sarah under the deck of the cabin where there's a bunch of bacon loaded. They pull her out. Then they continue to look, and of course the mate and the captain keep saying, there's nobody else on the ship. Well, they keep looking. And they ended up finding all of the others on the ship hidden in the wheat. So at 7 o'clock, the Kazia then is towed back to City Point. And when they get to City Point, they send a dispatch to Petersburg saying, we're going to be there at 6 o'clock. We've got the Kazia and we've got the escaped slaves. Well, they didn't get there until like 7 o'clock. But when the news hit Petersburg, big crowds started gathering at the docks. And everybody was all upset. They were yelling things like, we need to hang him, and we need to tar and feather him, and all these things. And the mayor and the sheriff and several police officers went there to keep order. Well, as at 7 o'clock, when the Towns comes around the bend of the river, towing the Kazia, the crowd gets all excited, and they come around and they tie the boats up, and they go to take the captain and the mate off the boats. And the crowd begins to shout, hang them, kill them, different things like that. And the newspaper article about it, quote, says, blows were struck at him, meaning Captain Bayless, lunges made for his throat, and all sorts of attempts to drag him into the mob without cessation. A large number of peaceable inclined citizens rallied to the aid of the police, successfully averting the threatened violence, and the men were in a few moments lodged in jail. Then the slaves were removed from the boat, and the article calls them the kidnapped. And they're taken for questioning. And they all say, well, Mr. Bayless, he enticed us on the boat and said if we had $50, he'd take us up north. Well, John Bull, who belonged to Andrew Keevan, he claimed that he was bound for St. Catherine's Hotel in Toronto, Canada, and that some of his friends there had engaged a job for him as a waiter if he could get there. Joe Mayo, who was owned by O.P. Hare, he confessed that he was on his way to New York, where his wife, who they called their refugee, was already there. And he claims he had sold all of his plunder for $30 in order to get there, and he had paid Bayless $48. Gilbert, the slave of Colonel Thomas Epps, had in his possession, now listen to this, he had $500 in gold and notes, which he alleged he had saved during 27 years as the profits accrued from raising pigs. And the other two had nothing much to say for themselves. Well, William Bayless, he was sentenced to 40 years in the state penitentiary, 8 years for each runaway, and was fined $500. The Kazia, valued at $800, was sold, and it was bought by Mr. Pinnell of the auction house, who was one of the ones that had gone looking for the Kazia. I think he only paid $300-some for it, but it was worth $800. John Bull, who was one of the runaways, he was later sold for $1,150, and he was taken to Tennessee. Look at that. He was worth a whole lot more than the ship. Well, Bayless's wife, Martha, she moved to Richmond to be near her husband, who was in the penitentiary, and she was lobbying relentlessly for his release. And it wasn't until March of 1865 that President Jefferson Davis pardoned him, and he returned to Delaware. And I think he lived out the rest of his life as a grocer there. John Clybourne, who wrote the book, he was the doctor in Petersburg that was in charge of the hospitals there during the Civil War. He wrote in his book, 75 Years in Old Virginia, that the Kazia affair raised concerns of local citizens as to the safety of their property. Following Bayless's capture, the only remaining conductor in Petersburg was an unknown black man who was believed to be a slave that was known as Ham and Eggs. And of course, after this, let's see, this is where the newspaper article was that reported on the Kazia. And this is my last slide right here, because on April of 1861, Virginia seceded from the Union. A couple months later, they joined the Confederacy, and we had the Civil War. And on April the 3rd, 1865, Petersburg was occupied by federal troops. And this is a picture right here of the Grant's wagon train heading west towards Appomattox. And that was taken on April the 3rd, 1865. In the early morning hours of April the 3rd, 1865 is when the enslaved people in Petersburg got their freedom, because that's the Emancipation Proclamation, that's when it was occupied. And that is my program. I'm sorry I ran over a little.